Falling Down the Aether Sky by Gianni. Chapter 1. Ruby. A dark wind swirled, ripe with gritty effluence. A lone discolored gull mourned, hanging in the turgid air, waiting for a ripe morsel, while several more bobbed in the sepia-colored river, its depths a reflection of the city's malaise. Amidst the squalor, a drab woman stood and stared at the river. With the myriad of pollutants and chemicals dumped in the river, Ruby wondered if it could even be considered water anymore. Long ago, this had been a source of dubious pride, the Cuyahoga, the river that burned. Ruby stared into the murky liquid of the river, sucking at the stump of a cigarette. The flats were the low-lying industrial banks of the river, and after various revivals and economic collapses had been reborn with expensive bars and holographic cyberspace of virtual TV, or VTV. Shaking her head and looking around the desolate flats, Ruby wondered how she had gotten so caught up in her thoughts. Early that gray Sunday morning, which was chilly with persistent rain, Ruby could only smell the reek of the water and see the debris and refuse idly floating among the yellow foam. She pulled hard on the last hit above the filter and flicked the glowing nub into the river. The leprous gull eyed her suspiciously. She eyed it back. She was in Cleveland with only one address of a friend from long ago. She stared down at the disposable cell phone with enough charge to send one more message. After it was sent, she sighed and tossed the cardboard phone into the river as well. Out of luck and out of money meant she'd have to walk through West Cleveland to meet him, and despite renovations, miles of squalor until Lakewood. She had one of those strange travel hangovers, a headache fog sitting just behind her eyes. She remembered several overnight bus rides and long, hazy layovers in places like Altoona and Cortland. Some clean clothes, a few nights of real sleep, and some decent food might give her a new outlook on life. Shaking herself out of the weary, buzzing fatigue, Ruby noticed the rain was starting to come down harder. She dug into her black canvas bag one last time, looking for change or city bus tokens, but only found an open piece of gum at the bottom. She chewed it for about a minute, but the grit got to her, and she spit the wad onto the ground. She sighed, squinted at the sky, saluted the gull, and slouched off through the river park, past sodden heaps of humans under the towering span of the Detroit Bridge. She shrugged herself deeper into the sweat jacket, leather coat, and woolen overcoat, all limp and worn as dead cats. The drabness and washed-out state of her clothing and demeanor matched the sky, the buildings, the ground, her soul. Inside of the Clifton lunch was bright with cold blue fluorescent light, and neither the food nor the decor had changed significantly in 50 years. As Ruby surveyed the linoleum-covered table set with institutional cups, plates, and sugar shakers, she slid into a booth to wait. The waitress frowned as she placed a cup of quick calf in front of Ruby and watched her pull a great wad of napkins from the dispenser to wipe off the acid-tinged rain from her close-cropped hair and face. Removing the sodden coats, Ruby sat back, careful to let her boots hang off the edge of the worn burgundy leather. Taking a sip, she settled back, blindly staring at the VTV. After 3 quick calf refills, Ruby sighed, wondering if Jamie would really come. She glanced down at her half-empty cup that had acquired a bitter-sour flavor on top of the oily veneer. A sudden slam made Ruby jump. Looking up, she smiled as Jamie made his entrance. He was a slave to fashion, spending ungodly amounts of money at some obscure cyber boutique on shopping. Furs were back in fashion, especially now that they were cloned, and Jamie, reminiscent of 80s pop excess, was resplendent in a floor-length dark teal fur. Well, 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 if it isn't Ruby Q, back from the dead or God knows wherever. Jamie pushed back his long blonde hair, smiled, and opened his arms. Despite the fact that you're filthy and probably smell atrocious, come here. I couldn't believe it when you texted. How long has it been? Why didn't you come to the house? You still have my address, don't you? Probably couldn't get past the gate looking like that. Ruby opened her mouth, but Jamie pushed her to arm's length and rambled on fatuously. It's been so long since I've come to the lunch. When was the last time you were here? What, 10 years ago? Pretend I didn't say that. I'm still only 26, you know. He blinked his large, faceted, emerald green eyes that had no whites. Ruby privately thought that people who went in for the recent fad of Mon-eye tints were idiots. Without regular visits to the eye salons, the color usually faded to a sickly yellow, giving a jaundiced look. Ruby had nothing. No implants or genetic manipulations, not even a prong jack for coastering space. Jamie, on the other hand, usually dove into each new fad with a vengeance. Ruby motioned for the waitress, who ignored her, probably thinking she wanted another refill. 2 hours later, relaxing under the shower, Ruby closed her eyes and sighed in the dim room. She would use more water than she should and Jamie would complain, but she couldn't help it. She remembered the public baths. What country was that? Turkey? Libya? Water was even more precious there. She remembered lying on a tile floor in the public bath and watching the jiggling of the sky hole in the ceiling reflected in the water in the crook of her arm. No wonder she didn't have any money, since she was always spending what little she had on traveling. Ruby spent a restless night and at 5:30 the next morning walked out into the small foyer between the rooms on the second floor. Jamie was still asleep and would probably be until at least afternoon. Ruby wondered if she should wake him, but felt guilty. Pulling up the borrowed pajama bottoms, Ruby crept down 2 flights of stairs, trying to avoid the squeaking of the old wood, and exhaled a small sigh as she entered the basement. She stood in the furnished basement and watched the VTV, still on from the night before, when Jamie was ministering to his dying mother. The VTV undulated with looping series of screensaver visualizations while Ruby stood and stared dumbly, then quietly mouthed, "Standard." Switching to VTV, the holographic plate and screen flickered and shimmered to a standard 3D viewing mode. Ruby had known Jamie from high school and watched him care for his mother, who'd been dying for decades from one of the environmentally induced genetic mutations. Ruby had always come back from her various odd jobs and travels to sit with Jamie in the basement kitchen drinking tea. She had never known what to say, but considered herself a wonderful listener, as Jamie ceaselessly ranted about current fashions, virtual porn stars, the government, or whatever else came up in the 5-minute nightly news. This was the first time she could relax in a long time. For so long, her journey had taken her to so many places, to closet flops and basement hostels, that Ruby couldn't remember a time that she had been at rest. She smiled, sitting on the worn couch. Lying back on the couch, she flicked the channels on the VTV, marveling at the number of senseless programs. As she began to think of the various things she wanted to do during the day, her mind began to drift, and shortly she again sank into sleep. Her eyes opened to the slight noise of gurgling, like the sound of air being blown into the straw at the bottom of a soda glass. She had fallen asleep on the couch with the executioner judge on the VTV. She saw Jamie stroking his mother's hair and whispering to her. Ruby turned away, closed her eyes, pretending to be asleep. When she heard Jamie wander in the kitchen and put the kettle on, she swung her legs off the couch and followed him. Turning her eyes, "How did you sleep?" he asked. "Can't believe I'm up this early. After you crashed, I went down to the West End to Slinky's Light Joint." Ruby smiled and reached into the cabinet for tea. "Still up for heading down to the Temp place? Hell, we might even find a J.O.B. for you." Jamie almost dropped the glass in mock horror. After sharing a pot of strong black tea, Ruby rooted through a box, rotting and blown out in one of the corners. It smelled funky, like maybe Jamie's freaky cat had been nesting in it. The box had been sitting in a long-forgotten corner of Jamie's basement closet for about 10 years. How many other boxes had she left in other basements scattered from Seattle to Boston? As she pulled up a brown silk shirt and close-cut black skirt, she wondered if even these, carefully selected for their timeless neutrality, would cause a stir because of their age. She buried her nose in the skirt, wincing at the odors, but she had neither the time nor the money for dry cleaning. She hoped they would do. There had been a time when Ruby thought she might come back, settle down, and try to make it as a cyber artist, creating websites that immersed the participants in a demented profusion of altered realities. For one summer, she had crashed with several other artists, living hand-to-mouth in closet flops, surrounded by their cyberspace hardware, or ware, eking out an existence. Not only had she been too impatient to try to gain a following, but being crammed up under the interstate bridges in a flop drove her insane. As the Boston-Providence sprawl expanded amoeba-like towards New York, mega highways erupted across the land like demented spirographs. The land under the highways became exploitable real estate, cheap, minimal housing, flops for the disenfranchised, the transient, and the poor of all races. The extruded plastic modules were stacked dozens high and deep, like maggots on a metal framework. But in the most blighted areas of the city, the flops hadn't yet encroached. The girders under the roadways and bridges in the decaying urban slums were populated by those who could drag wood, cloth slings, and corrugated metal to create living spaces and cling like epoxied lichen with the pigeons in the rafters of the crumbling overpasses. As Ruby sifted through the box of clothes and other detritus from another life, she remembered the long hours staring out the bus window without the entertainment and oblivion of space, watching the superhighways arcing elegantly in the distance. That night she had crouched in an abandoned closet flop outside of Harrisburg, wrapped in her coats, hugging her meager belongings. In the silvery glow of the moon, she had unwrapped the worn, faded slip of paper with Jamie's number and address. The address was barely visible, but it was her last hope. End Chapter 1 of Falling Down the Aether Sky. This book is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and World Castle Publishing. Thank you.